Did you know that Glorfindel once died fighting a Balrog, but he was resurrected and brought back to life? Alla Tulia Meldonia Ahara Mariese, my name is Rainbow Dave, and welcome to another Tolkien Fun Fact video. So, I feel amongst Tolkien fans there is an age-old question, and I'm sure it's one that you yourselves have all grappled with over the years. And that question is, who is your favourite character in the entire Legendarium? Now, I'm not going to try and answer that, it's entirely subjective and everyone's going to have their own opinions, but throughout the many conversations that I've had on this topic, there is one name that keeps on coming up again and again and again, and it's a curious choice, because this character appears so briefly in The Lord of the Rings, and he's only one of hundreds in the Silmarillion. And yet, in spite of that, he is undeniably a fan favourite character. And of course, this character is Glorfindel. So, the question is this: what makes Glorfindel so much more special than the myriad of other elves in Tolkien's tales? Well, if you were reading The Lord of the Rings when it was first published back in 1954, then Glorfindel might at first seem just like the many other elves who get introduced and named, but then never appear again. You know, there's Gildor in Glorion, Erestor, Galdor of the Havens, and Lindir, who are just a few examples, but even in The Lord of the Rings, Glorfindel does stand out from the crowd. And this is partly due to Tolkien's physical description of the Elven Lord. Now, Tolkien was notoriously reticent in describing what his characters actually look like. You know, pretty much all we get about Frodo is that he is a stout fellow with red cheeks. And something as simple as like Legolas's hair colour has become a subject of intense debate amongst fans. And you don't even want to get started on whether or not Balrogs have wings. But Glorfindel does seem to be an exception to this rule. You see, Tolkien tells us that Glorfindel was tall and straight. His hair was of shining gold. His face fair and young and fearless and full of joy. His eyes were bright and keen, and his voice like music. On his brow sat wisdom, and in his hand was strength. So even in his first appearance, this dude does sound pretty perfect. But there is of course a whole lot more to Glorfindel than just his looks. And in The Lord of the Rings, his great claim to fame is that he is instrumental in getting Frodo safely across the Bruinen and away from the clutches of the Nazgul. And there is no doubt that this is a big deal. If Glorfindel had failed, then who knows what would have become of the ring and its bearer. But when it comes to the full extent of Glorfindel's contributions to Middle-earth, this is only the tip of the iceberg. It is only 11 days, it's less than 2 weeks in the life of a being who is older than the sun. So, in order to tell this full story, we're going to need to go back all the way to the First Age, and to the arguably greatest elven city ever to exist in Middle-earth, the secret city of Gondolin. So, Gondolin was ruled by King Turgon, who is the original owner of Gandalf's sword, Glamdring. And among Turgon's top warriors / advisors / friends was the chief of the House of the Golden Flower, Lord Glorfindel himself. Now, alongside another inconceivably badass elven lord called Ecthelion, Glorfindel was chosen to partake in all of King Turgon's most important ventures. He escorted Turgon's sister through the land of Shelob's siblings, which ended really badly for everyone. He fought in the great battle of Unnumbered Tears, which also ended pretty badly for everyone. And he was on the front lines when Gondolin came under attack and was eventually overrun. But, unlike both Ecthelion and King Turgon himself, Glorfindel was not slain in the Fall of Gondolin. In fact, he held his ground to the very end, and he fought valiantly to allow time for the surviving refugees of predominantly women and children to flee the burning city. But still, Glorfindel did not die. He eventually followed the survivors, and he too escaped the ruins of Gondolin. However, as is often the case, things did swiftly turn from bad to worse when the refugees were ambushed on a high and narrow mountain path. And of all the evil things that they could possibly have been ambushed by, it was of course a Balrog who appeared behind them. But all was not lost, because the refugees of Gondolin still had Glorfindel amongst them. And in this moment, Glorfindel proved his quality 1,000 times over. He stabbed the Balrog in the belly, and the demon fell from the mountainside, plummeting to its death in the abyss below. But in its final seconds of life, the Balrog reached out and it grabbed Glorfindel by his golden hair. And so, both Balrog and Elven Lord fell together, and they perished in the chasm beneath the mountainside. Now, there are some interesting parallels to be drawn here between Glorfindel and Gandalf. Because, of course, they both died taking down a Balrog. And they both did so in a bit of a murder-suicide that involved falling. In fact, Gothmog, who is the lord of the Balrogs, he is the mightiest of their entire order, he is also slain in the exact same way by that other awesome elf, Ecthelion. And just like Glorfindel and Gandalf, Ecthelion also died in his battle with the Balrog. So I guess in order to kill a Balrog, you have to be willing to give up your own life. But anyway, there you go. In the year 510 of the First Age, Glorfindel, the Lord of the House of the Golden Flower, tragically died. But, unlike most people, he didn't stay that way. Now, this is where things get a little controversial, because in the books it remains unclear whether this Glorfindel of Gondolin is the same dude as Glorfindel of Rivendell, who of course features in The Lord of the Rings. And it certainly isn't beyond the realms of possibility that there might just be two separate elves who share the name Glorfindel. I mean, just consider how many famous Johns there have been throughout our own history. And furthermore, we know that Tolkien did recycle names in his Legendarium. In fact, the elf who led these refugees away from Gondolin in the first place was one Legolas Greenleaf. And yet we know this is not the same Legolas who later joins the Fellowship in the Third Age. So, how do we know that this Glorfindel of Gondolin and Glorfindel of Rivendell are the same character? Well, Tolkien actually tells us. You see, in the Peoples of Middle-earth, there is a chapter entitled The Last Writings, which is a collection of notes that were written only a year before Tolkien died. And in this chapter, Tolkien tells us that although people may have speculated that the two Glorfindels are different characters, Tolkien says, this repetition of so striking a name, though possible, would not be credible. And later he goes on to write that after his purging of any guilt that had incurred in the rebellion, he was released from Mandos, and Manwë restored him. We may then best suppose that Glorfindel returned during the Second Age. Now, this means that Glorfindel is one of the only elves in the entire Legendarium who dies, but then gets reborn in the West and returns to Middle-earth. In fact, Lúthien the Fair is the only other elf we know of who has this distinction, but unlike Glorfindel, Lúthien was reborn as a mortal, stripped of all her former Ainur powers. Glorfindel, on the other hand, though, he comes back with more divine power than he ever possessed before. And he uses this Ainur light to drive the Nazgul into the Bruinen, where they are of course washed away by the great flood of Elrond and Gandalf. So, this makes Glorfindel almost unique. Like so many others, he died in Middle-earth, and yet, unlike all of them, he came back better than ever. The only other character in the entire Legendarium with that kind of claim to fame is, of course, Gandalf the White. So there you go. Glorfindel is not just any other elf. Not by a long shot. And before I finish, there's one more fun fact about him that I want to share with you all. You see, throughout the Third Age, after he was resurrected, Glorfindel didn't do a huge amount in like the grand scheme of things, but he was present for one last major battle. And this battle was in the ruins of Fornost, the former capital of the Kingdom of Arnor. And the great enemy of this battle was the Witch King of Angmar. Now, this battle ended in victory for the Free Peoples. And after the Witch King's defeat, he fled south all the way back to the lands of Mordor. But before he fled, the Witch King looked upon a man called Eärnur, who had the distinction of being the last king of Gondor. And the Witch King charged at him, and although Eärnur held his ground, his horse was seized by the terror of the Witch King, and it turned and ran. And the Witch King mocked King Eärnur for his perceived cowardice, and Eärnur was inclined to break ranks and chase after the Lord of the Nazgul in reply. But it was Glorfindel who held him back. He told Eärnur to let the Witch King go, and he spoke the now famous words, "Far off yet is his doom, and not by the hand of man will he fall." Now, if we skip forward 1044 years, we will arrive at another battle. The Battle of Pelennor Fields. And once again, the Witch King will fight in this battle, and in his arrogance, he will believe himself unkillable. After all, not by the hand of man will he fall. But as we all know, the Witch King does fall. And it isn't by the hand of man, but by the hands of a halfling and a woman. Just as Glorfindel prophesied all those years ago. Anyway, thank you all very much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video. And as always, until next time, dear friends, much love. Stay groovy, and Navaya Melanin.